session, and thank you for Wahine Toa, who really, I think, have a great panel. We're moving on to a panel called Sustainable World, which is a very big and pretentious title, but we have an eminently qualified panel to address this. I'll introduce them one by one as they speak. We're going to try and keep presentations fairly short again, give us plenty of time for discussion. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker, who is Simon Terry. Simon is Executive Director of the Sustainability Council, and amongst other things, Simon has previously been an investment banker and financial journalist. So, Simon, please, over to you.
Thank you, Barry. Trade policy and the integration of the environment is the issue I want to draw to your attention, because it's the failure to integrate trade and environment, or the environment within trade policy, that perhaps explains quite a bit of what we're seeing. To actually integrate the two would involve a recognition that trade policy needs to respect environmental bottom lines. In other words, the commerce that is behind trade, that drives trade, would actually have to live within environmental limits of some point. It would be constrained in a way that currently there is no political consensus that that sort of activity should be constrained. So while you might see in leaked drafts of the tppa when it was first developed, the idea that the treaty should at least begin to look at how trade and the environment should be integrated, to use the word they put there, to make it coherent, that got scrapped. It doesn't even exist as a goal in that 6,000 pages of legal text, because it would come right back to this idea that the environment actually takes priority, that it sets a boundary. And that failure basically leads to the conclusion that trade policy overall has become an exacerbator of environmental stress and environmental degradation, rather than an enabler of rising environmental standards. And the lack of willingness to respect those environmental bottom lines goes some way to explaining the sort of things that you see in real life. When a trade treaty obligation comes up against an environmental treaty obligation, guess where governments run to interpret which treaty has priority? And when you compare across the chapters of something like the TPP, now the CPTPP, in that 6,000 pages of text, there is a full environment chapter, and it was touted very loudly by the Obama administration as being a gold standard chapter. But if you did a quick comparison between what is required of a party signing up to the environmental section and what they would be required, for example, under intellectual property rules, very, very specific and wide sweeping obligations under intellectual property, meaningful sanctions. When you come to the environment chapter, it's governments, you sort your own standards, we're fine, whatever goes with you is fine, and sanctions and ability to discipline are just about nil. The Peru-US FTA is often cited as one that had real tough stuff built into it, turned out to be a complete lemon when it came to enforcing it. And this is, that's sort of the standard fare. So I return to the general picture. If you take the broad picture, what you have is trade agreements that have this nice little green fringe tacked onto it to sort of give the illusion of green, without ever addressing the architecture that supports an unlimited extraction of the environment in the process. The ISDS provisions, which many of you are familiar with, I don't need to go into detail, but you will be aware that they basically give foreign investors rights to sue governments in private tribunals, or not exactly private tribunals, but less than totally public tribunals, where the foreign investor believes that a new government action leads to a loss of future profits. And for the environment, that is a complete killer. It's a killer, firstly, because the stats that come out from the US and its trade treaties are indicating that something over 85% of the claims by value involve the environment and natural resources. That's where a lot of the sharp action comes. But it's the iceberg effect below the waterline that is the real killer. It's when the government of the day feels that if it is to take new action in support of stronger environmental standards, that it'll be dragged off to a tribunal where the average cost of appearing is $8 million. They look at that and go, well, who is going to vote for me if I do this, this measure which is going to put me at risk politically, as opposed to if I just don't do that? And the reports out of various places are that a so-called chilling effect takes place, where actions sort of come up through government agencies that are going to be pro-environmental, and people get wind of these who might be affected, and the thought that an action might trigger such a tribunal action tends to send it back down the list, and it just doesn't get through. So in a period when we have excess demand on the environment and we need to raise standards drastically, something like that turns out to be a major detriment on making progressive change. And when you put it all together, the asymmetry is really quite stunning. You have those ISDS provisions in a treaty give a foreign investor rights to prosecute, to protect its private wealth, where there are nothing like reciprocal rights for non-state actors to defend common property, the global commons or local commons, for the public good. And that asymmetry tells you a great deal about the current architecture. It's important that the incoming government in New Zealand has made clear it doesn't believe ISDS provisions are needed in future agreements, and that's a good piece of housekeeping. We can sort of clean that one away. But the real business begins right back at a much more fundamental level. And I want to return to that issue of actually acknowledging that economic activity can only take place within environmental limits. You might find that as a sort of a piece of rhetoric or passing phrase that you would regard as commonly understood, but it's not represented in those trade treaties or other treaties, really. It's a question that still remains to be answered. Someone once put it very nicely that the economy is in fact a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. Until that is reflected in economic activity and in the trade treaties and other treaties, it's not a reality. And it's actually a deeply ethical question at base, because, as Wayne pointed out earlier, some Indigenous peoples have used a rule of thumb that if something is right or can be sustained through to 7 generations without effect on the next generation, then that's a sort of a sustainability test that you can use to indicate whether something is right or not. To take a very simple example, our carbon emissions involved in international transport are 6% of global emissions. They are not really properly offset in any respect, I wouldn't think, or minimally at best. And that, by definition, is imposing a burden on future generations which is uncompensated and not acknowledged. So somewhere in the very beginnings of this, one needs a very fundamental understanding of, and acceptance that environmental limits actually take priority. Trade agreements would then need to reference appropriate treaties. They would need to actually have those things sufficiently embedded and strong enough to guide and be effective in using to make judgments around trade. Trade agreements would also need to be clearly framed from a public good perspective. When I go through the detail of the CPTPP, I'm constantly struck by the frame of reference being that the lens of the foreign investor, as though attracting foreign investment is the reason one has an agreement which, when you cut across all of the chapters, is fundamentally about a restructuring of governance arrangements. And you don't conduct governance arrangements through the party you want to solicit to bring in. It also would need to establish the principle that there'd be no rights to non-state actors to engage with governments that are not given to those in the host country just the same. This idea that foreign investors get rights that locals do not get is not principled and completely inappropriate. Another element one would quickly put in on the positive side are environmental border taxes. This is the notion that at the point a country who is setting strong standards regarding environmental performance wants to make sure that its green companies are not suddenly undercut by cheap imports. It means that if, for example, a country that has a strong carbon tax in place would tax goods from another country that didn't have such a tax to a level that made the imports compatible in carbon terms, and thereby, encourage, not just even neutralise, but encourage this sort of greening of the economy and recognition of environmental externalities. And that's something Jeff Bertram and I have talked about, and Jeff's done a lot more detail on, and I believe he's going to talk about it in his piece.
Thank you, Simon. I think you're absolutely right in what you say around in whose benefit are these trade agreements written, and a lot of them include phrases like no more burdensome than necessary. And it's kind of burdensome to whom? Is it burdensome to users of healthcare services or to the general public? No, it's burdensome to foreign investors, and it's quite revealing to see that. You've said that standards should be democratically determined for the environment, that there should be national sovereignty over environmental standards. How do we avoid a kind of a race to the bottom? Is that a much stronger network of environmental agreements agreed multilaterally, or how does that happen?
This one? Okay. I think the easy way to approach this is to talk about an example currently running where the US government, as a major exporter of GM food, is seeking to harmonise standards around approvals for GMOs. And that's not the dead food that you can import, that's actually whether you can, the conditions under which would be approved for growing in a particular country, with the objective of harmonising what is in the end not just a question of is it safe food, it involves a number of other questions around the risks and benefits of altering food that has environmental risks which are still being actively played out. So what it would seek to do is impose a global standard on risk assessment, which the experts will tell you, risk is not something that you can objectively define or analyse. Risk is something that communities assess, and to take away that ability to locally determine risk is something that is a clear kind of offence to the democratic process. So it's about distinguishing between where you would harmonise simply for something that has an easily agreed standard and something where it's actually impinging on decision making. Making that cut would be important.
Thank you. We'll move on. I'll invite Jeff Bertram to add some remarks. Jeff's Senior Associate at the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University. He's written extensively on climate change, macroeconomics, and particularly regulation. Jeff has described himself as an economist, and I hope he's going to have some comments on the state of the economics profession.
No.
Thank you, Jeff.
No, I just want to do something very specific in the first bit of my time here. That is to lay down that whatever else is in a progressive trade agreement or trade strategy in the future, climate change is unavoidable as a central topic. It's going to be either unavoidable in the sense that the global economy will be coping with the consequences of unchecked climate change, or it's going to be central in the sense that the global economy has done dramatic stuff to meet the sort of targets the IPCC has been setting up. And so fundamentally one has to think the next half century or so The central business challenge that the world economy will confront is saving the planet. And while this may sound trite looking from here, we are talking about enormous opportunities in business, investment, employment, distribution of income and assets across the global economy. So it's worth keeping an eye on. And a problem that we've had so far with attempts to do climate change at the national level has been that it's repeatedly stymied by talk about trade exposure or competitiveness of your trade exposed sectors in the economy. So in New Zealand, right from the outset with the emissions trading scheme, the government has simply neutered the emissions trading scheme by giving exemptions to the biggest polluters, heavy industry and agriculture, on the grounds that if we were to force them to pay the social cost of carbon, they wouldn't be able to compete in the global marketplace. And that argument is amazingly persuasive to people who haven't thought about trade theory, I guess. And so I just want to talk about how you handle that one in a progressive setting. If you're getting a global price on carbon, or within a nation, just getting a price on carbon is absolutely central to getting structural shifts to happen in the economy. And because it's unlikely that we're going to get a globally harmonised carbon price anytime in the near future, we have to be talking about nationally set carbon prices. And if we're doing that, we have to look at the consequences of high carbon prices in New Zealand for the trading sectors in this economy. That is our export sectors and to some extent our import competing sectors. And because there's not going to be global harmonisation in the near future, there's always been a strong case for border adjustments. To understand border adjustments, you have to look at the way we apply GST in New Zealand. GST, we mark up the prices of goods and services bought by New Zealanders here to provide revenue for the government. Right? With a carbon tax, you mark up the prices of stuff that's being traded in the New Zealand economy to capture the externality of carbon emissions. All right? So the goal is a little different, but the instrument is the same instrument. It's a tax based on output to capture something that you are trying to bring into the taxation frame. All right? Now, what do we do with GST? With GST, if New Zealand exporters had to export their stuff with 15% added onto the price, they would be a good deal less competitive. So at the border, as the stuff leaves, the GST goes off and it goes out there at the pre-GST price. Stuff coming in arrives without the GST added to it, and it's selling in competition with local products which have been marked up 15%. You put GST on as they cross the border. This is not rocket science. You don't need many pages to put this in place. But we are talking here about the sort of space for democratic national action that has been mentioned earlier today. What sort of space do we need to clear for nations to be free to occupy in coping with the climate change challenge? And if they're going to do it with carbon taxes, what mechanisms do we need to have to protect their ability to do that? So I just want to emphasise that if you have border adjustments in place, that is, if goods going out of New Zealand get their carbon tax remitted at the border, and goods coming into New Zealand get their carbon tax added at the border as they come in, all the stuff about trade exposure is gone. You don't have to exempt anybody from the carbon tax. You don't have to run around having lobbyists telling you about how the TY Point smelter will close, blah, blah, blah. You just simply put a border adjustment on. You have a domestic relative price of carbon that is set by domestic priorities and decisions, and you trade out there in the real world, outside our borders, at the sort of prices that prevail out there. And so I want to emphasise that this is fully consistent with the principle of free trade. It just keeps the trade playing field level while enabling individual economies or groups of economies to use carbon taxes to pursue zero carbon strategies. And there are two other points I wanted to add to this. First one is that Bill Nordhaus, who just got a Nobel Prize for some other stuff, has been proposing carbon clubs of nations which do get their carbon taxes harmonised, so that they're all charging the same price on carbon, being able to form a trade area which has a single tariff around the outside to protect them from dumping from high carbon economies. Right? And that principle of dumping is something that's always been there in the trade literature. It's always been the case that dumping is a breach of the spirit of free trade. And in this case, we're talking about countries that sell untaxed high carbon goods into an economy where low carbon strategies are being pursued. And in that case, you are actually putting an anti-dumping duty on to their goods as they come over the border. So, at the same time, exporters from low carbon countries whose products are fully competitive except for the carbon charges embodied in them have to be allowed to sell their products free of the carbon tax in overseas jurisdictions that have high carbon policies. Now you can see this as second best. This is not an ideal world I'm talking about. It's a second best policy response to the inability of the global economy to get a harmonised single carbon tax in place. And the moment the international economy gets the price of carbon right, you can relax and let your border adjustments go off. Now, it's a pity that, as Jane said earlier, there's positives and negatives to it, that Trump has been weaponising tariffs. Right? Tariffs are now a weapon in global geopolitical manoeuvring. And he's doing it in pursuit of a geopolitical offensive against China. It does mean, though, that now, in contrast to 5 years ago, the strategic use of tariffs and subsidies to pursue strategic objectives is back on the trade agenda. And progressives don't need to be scared of that or fearful of leaping into the debate. Once you've got strategic tariffs being played around with, you can harness them to progressive objectives, as well as to Trump's rather different view of the world. Okay, so that's my... Great.
Thanks very much. We'll hold questions till afterwards, and Stephen is gathering questions, so Jill's got a question, Stephen, so and others. Thank you very much, Jeff. I've got a follow-up question on that. Can you talk a little bit more about the border tax adjustment issues and the kind of the idea of the carbon club? Does it require a kind of a relatively similar carbon price, for example, amongst all the members of a carbon club in order to create that external barrier? What do you see as some kind of way that can be taken forward? Because it's a very powerful idea, and it's been around for a while, but it actually hasn't got off the drawing board.
Well, the standard answer to this is you can start with one country. All the lead country has to do, this is a strategic dynamic game, put their hand up and say, we're going to do this, here's our border adjustment, away we go. Anybody like to sign on? And I know in an ideal world, lots of people will hasten to sign on. In the real world, maybe nobody signs on, but you don't have a big downside from it. What you have is a potentially big upside. So in an earlier presentation a year or two ago, I said Tuvalu could put their hand up and say, we're the first mover, we're going to do this. Anybody like to join us? And if they got the critical mass, the thing becomes self-reinforcing, it grows to the point where it has strategic leverage at the level of the global economy. If it doesn't take off, you've lost nothing. It's a pure positive sum game that you're playing. And I think that's, in the longer run, that's why it's a persuasive strategy, because the incentives to join a carbon club are going to become stronger and stronger as the climate change pressure comes on, and the damage from not joining a carbon club potentially become bigger over time. And with those two things in play, if you can just sustain the idea, it can potentially give you a path forward. I'm not guaranteeing anything, though.
That's great. I kind of would love to see a future where the Pacific Island countries are leading on the creation of a carbon club to do this. So let's move on. It's my pleasure to introduce Russell Norman, who needs very little introduction to anyone. Russell is Executive Director of Greenpeace New Zealand and was previously a List MP and co-leader of the Green Party. I asked Russell for something personal, and he said he enjoys deep sea swimming, particularly around oil rigs.
Thanks, Barry. Tēnā koutou, it's great to be here. I'm hopefully going to have a short presentation. I hope you're all coping at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon. A lot of what I think is important to say has been said by the previous two speakers. I just want to add a couple of things. So I just want to say I endorse what the previous two speakers have said, and I think that they've made really, really important points. Specifically, I think what we need is within the text of future agreements is that multilateral environment agreements trump trade agreements. It needs to be explicit in the text. So if you have a case taken against you, and Simon's totally right, government officials are always concerned about that a case may be taken against them if they take a particular regulatory action. That if a case comes against you, that you have an absolute defence in order to achieve the goals of a multilateral environment agreement. So if you sign up to the Paris Agreement and you take action, for example, to end oil exploration in order to achieve the goals of that agreement, and an oil seismic blasting company like Schlumberger were to threaten action against your government, which is currently on the cards in New Zealand at the moment, they're threatening action against New Zealand, that you have an absolute defence on the grounds of a multilateral, achieving the purposes of a multilateral environment agreement, such as the Paris Agreement. Now you may, of course, there is a national security absolute defence in almost all of the trade agreements currently, so you can, so whenever Donald Trump says I'm going to slap some tariffs on something, he usually says, and I'm doing it because of national security reasons. Because he knows that he has, under pretty much all the agreements, he has an absolute right to rely on a national security defence if he cites that. There's a series of questions about if a case came against you, an ISDS case, whether what you were doing was proportionate, whether it was the right way to go about it, and so forth and so on. But nonetheless, creating an absolute defence of achieving the goals of a multilateral environment agreement seems to me essential if we're going to achieve our goals such as climate change. Now, of course, there's a bunch of environment issues, and I've been asked specifically to talk about water and mining, but there's a bunch of environment issues which are not immediately global in nature, in a way that climate change is immediately and unavoidably and essentially global in nature, and water can be like that. So if we have a freshwater crisis in New Zealand, in many ways it's specific to New Zealand. It's not a global freshwater crisis, it's not unrelated to the global freshwater crisis, but there is a specific freshwater crisis in New Zealand. We know that if the New Zealand government does what it needs to do, which is essentially introduce a haircut on all existing consents to reduce the water abstraction and the pollution rights of all existing consent holders in the country, there would be a bunch of foreign-owned consent holders who would potentially be able to take action against New Zealand under ISDS provisions. And so there not only needs to be a defence in our treaty which is about multilateral environment agreements, there also needs to be a defence in order to protect the New Zealand environment which is specific to us. So there needs to be these kind of two levels, if you like, of environmental defence, one about a multilateral agreement and one about the specific issues that any particular country faces. So that the water rights issue is obviously a very live one that we're facing at the moment. We kind of have two layers to that, of course. We have the current freshwater crisis. We also have the question of treaty rights around fresh water. And dealing with both of those issues, I think inevitably will involve a haircut on existing consent holders in order, firstly, to reduce the pollution going into water and the abstraction of fresh water from rivers and so forth, but also to create the headroom in which to deal with the entirely valid treaty claims around fresh water. We're going to need some headroom to deal with those. And so both of those, if you're Synlait, for example, and or any foreign-owned dairy producer in New Zealand, you could rightly argue that the value of your investment in New Zealand would be reduced as a result of that. And that would be a form of indirect expropriation under a classic ISDS case. So we need defences for both of those levels. The last thing I wanted to say was about the kind of political ground in which to win these, because we can't just win these battles domestically. And it kind of relates to the bigger problem we're having in terms of the turbulence in the global governance system. A lot of the turbulence in the global governance system is resting on a nationalist call. So whether it's Donald Trump or whether it's the far right in Europe or many other places, nationalism is being mobilised as a kind of as a discursive power in order to win a number of these battles, right? And it seems to me that we should be mobilising globalism. We should be the champions of global governance. Now, the problem is that over the last 30 years, a kind of neoliberal version of global governance has dominated the global narrative. So the very people who introduced the neoliberal revolution in New Zealand and many other places were the ones who got control of what it meant to form global governance institutions, so in the post-80s era. And even when we beat them at a national level in terms of the argument around neoliberalism, which is pretty much in many respects kind of won in New Zealand now, these people are still at these international meetings instituting and implementing neoliberal kind of policy frameworks in those global agreements. So it seems to me that we didn't let, but it happened to us that globalism and globalisation got defined in a very neoliberal kind of way. But it doesn't need to be like that. And in fact, I would argue we have no choice but to embrace a progressive global agenda. Because when you think about climate change in particular, but there are no doubt other global environmental challenges that we face, there are only global solutions. We cannot solve these problems without great global governance. We need strong global governance structures to resolve a problem like climate change. And that means that we need to have an identity and a call to being global citizens if we are to solve these kinds of problems. We simply cannot solve them at a national level or by trying to mobilise a national sovereignty kind of discourse. Obviously, those kind of national sovereignty discourses are important, but we also must mobilise a global identity or a global citizenship discourse. And I actually think it's a really powerful narrative, and I think that there are many people in the world who are yearning to see themselves and to be part of a global progressive community which supports things like a Paris Climate Agreement, because without a Paris Climate Agreement, it is an intractable problem. Without a kind of global set of agreements around a problem like climate change, it's very hard to see how we can solve them because they require global cooperation. So I think that to me is one of the really important parts of what the solution looks like. So it's not just about making sure that in agreements, the trade agreements, that we protect our right to regulate, though obviously it is about that. It's also about making sure that we have good global agreements like multilateral environment agreements which are enforceable right across the planet and set minimum environmental standards. Because I don't see how we're going to solve some of the global environmental problems we have without those kind of agreements.
Thank you, Russell. I think that's a great challenge to say how can we get that global movement to support the kind of MEAs and changes to trade rules. We've been much better on trade rules at fighting the things that we don't like rather than fighting for things we do like. So do you, as a campaigner, do you have ideas as to where the kind of touch points are as to how we can take a campaign forward that actually would pick up from some of the discussions we're having today about the alternatives, about the changes in fundamentals of trade agreements that might actually build a really strong public coalition behind them?
The short answer is no. The longer answer is I think for organisations like Greenpeace, which I've been involved in now for a few years, they, I think, are in a strong position to promote the idea of global identity, right? I think we need to promote the idea of global identity, and I don't see many people doing it, to be honest. I see very few people in the progressive movement promoting the idea of global identity. This doesn't surprise me, right? If extraterrestrials arrived on our planet tomorrow and threatened our planet, very soon we would have a global identity. And I mean this in absolute seriousness, right? Because there is nothing like a threat to create an identity out of what is currently not an identity. If there was literally an extraterrestrial threat to the survival of planet Earth, we would very soon come to call ourselves Earthlings. It would happen extremely rapidly, right? We actually do now have an existential threat to life on this planet, which is global in nature. It's called climate change. It doesn't come from extraterrestrials, it's come from us. But nonetheless, we need to gather together as Earthlings in order to confront this thing, because there is no other solution that's going to work unless we see ourselves as global citizens, as Earthlings. So I think there's a responsibility, particularly on multinational environment organisations and many other multinational institutions, but I would argue for everyone in the progressive movement, we should be promoting the idea that we are Earthlings and we have a global identity and we have a lot in common with each other. I particularly think it's relevant right now because of the rise of nationalism. So, you know, Donald Trump, you know, he's not doing any of this for any progressive-minded thing. He's, you know, obviously we all are well aware of that. But it's like the narrative around nationalism is not a progressive narrative, right? There are many great things about New Zealand, but what am I first and foremost? I am a citizen of the planet. I am an Earthling. I'm a human. I share this planet with 7 billion other Earthlings, you know? And that's, for me, the first thing that kind of defines me, right? Now, I don't think that kind of identity is very common on this planet at the moment, but I don't see how we're going to solve a problem like climate change unless the progressive movement promotes that idea.
Thank you. I think that's great. Earthlings to make our planet great again. Here we go. Yeah. Good. We're going to move on. It's my great pleasure to introduce Aroha Mead. Aroha is a political scientist who works across many disciplines, including Indigenous rights and sustainable development. She's Chair Emeritus of the IUCN Commission on Environmental, Economic and Social Policy, and has recently been appointed to the Advisory Board of Fonterra. She loves not being in academia or government, but being a free agent.
Kia ora koutou katoa, he mihi tuatahi kia Ngāti Whātua o Rākei. Well, the last speaker of the day, so thank you all for those who've stayed with us. I'm going to take us into a very different space, Russell, and just come back to some of the issues that you've been hearing since the very beginning when Ngāti Whātua welcomed us here, that you have seen that there remain some fundamental issues of a constitutional nature that have yet to be resolved in Aotearoa in relation to the Treaty of Waitangi and the Tino Rangatiratanga and Kaitiakitanga of Hapu and Iwi over their taonga, the treasures inherited from the ancestors. And these treasures include not just lands and waters, but landscapes and ecosystems and species and the genetic resources, as well as a very rich cultural heritage that includes a knowledge system about the environment and the interaction of people with the environment that is deeply embedded in intergenerational wisdom and values and practices. And until such time that these fundamental issues are satisfactorily worked through, there will always be an underlying skepticism about the promises of global trade. And when the Crown says that it has a priority to protect and enhance national interests as a bottom line in the various trade agreements it enters into, we can't help but have reservations about who is actually included in the national interest. We can't see ourselves in there. Because if there is no agreement at the national level about hapu and iwi having kaitiakitanga over their taonga tuku iho, then there is a high risk that Māori rights and interests will be eroded rather than enhanced through trade agreements. So 1999, you may well have heard of the Y262 claim, 262 being the chronological number that this claim was lodged with the Waitangi Tribunal. That claim is known as the Indigenous Flora and Fauna claim, and the claimant sought confirmation of Māori rights and interests through Article 2 of the treaty. The tribunal conducted 2 sets of hearings, and after 19 years in the system, finally released their report, Ko Aotearoa TNA, in 2011. And 8 years later, we're still waiting for the Crown to respond to the tribunal's report. The Y262 claim challenged the colonial culture of asserting ownership over everything and anything, and not just Māori land, but native flora and fauna. And with this culture of using legislation to assert ownership and being very aggressive about ownership, in fact, almost treating ownership as you would think of a hoarder, just collecting and collecting and collecting and dumping somewhere with no order to it and no structure to it. We would argue that the same attention that the Crown has put into claiming ownership has not ever been paid to the duty of care, of caring for what it has assumed ownership of. And as a result, in the latest report, over 4,000 Indigenous species are now threatened or at risk of extinction, or put another way, between 2010 and 2016, nearly 83% of our native birds, bats, reptiles and frogs classified at risk of extinction or highly threatened. Our rivers are degraded. According to the Our Land 2008 report from Ministry for the Environment, 192 million tonnes of soil was lost through erosion. I recently saw a video that my whanaunga from Ngāti Pro put out of going deep into the heartland of the Raukumara Ranges, where you would expect in the heart of these native forests to hear all the birds and to have thick undergrowth, and 2 days into tramping and the undergrowth was completely gone. They could just walk through the forest. There was nothing there. No sound of birds. Now that's the kind of care that the Crown has given to what it says it owns. And what I've always found in a really unusual and puzzling dynamic in New Zealand is that many who are committed to the environment, even though they know how much harm is being caused through neglect by government, they'd still rather have that than have lands returned to Māori. They will do anything but actually return the lands to Māori. And even though we've had some quite innovative treaty settlements, we've had part of our nature become a legal personality, we have co-governance, we have co-management, we really have everything on the table except the return outright to Māori to make decisions. And I think part of that comes from this fear that Māori will somehow do exactly what the Crown has done, which is regulate, not allow access, and perhaps further diminish. And there's really, for me, a progressive future is one where people have more trust that Māori as tangata whenua actually have the best interests of the environment and the richness of this country at heart. So the harm that's being caused is wasn't caused a century ago. It wasn't during the time of the Moor, which we continually get dragged up. It's actually quite recent. These are poor policies and poor decisions that are being made right now. And Māori cultural expressions are continuing to be misappropriated by overseas companies, including companies in countries that New Zealand has free trade agreements with. So I just want to come back to my initial point that really until such time that government has the very discussions with Māori that it has been steadfastly avoiding, the constitutional status of the treaty, tino rangatiratanga of hapu and iwi, responding to all of the issues raised through Y262, the scepticism of government to adequately factor Māori interests will remain. And I just also wanted to say this concept of a global citizen, while I can relate to it in terms of a global community of people, I think the fundamental issue of your identity as a tangata whenua person belonging to a land is of such paramount importance to making wise decisions that I wouldn't want to see this leap into global, because the whole part of being local is that it makes you make wise decisions to protect the resources that are there. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Aroha. Could I just ask a follow-up question? I guess perhaps a counterpoint of the Earthlings for Common Responsibility is a greater connection of Indigenous peoples around defining those rights and restoring those rights. To what degree do you think that has power as a concept, or is it necessary to struggle on a country by country or even iwi by iwi basis?
Not an easy question to answer, but I guess what I'm suggesting here is more than an acceptance that Māori or Indigenous people have rights and interests that should be protected. It's that the societies in which we live should also be comfortable with those values and trust them a little bit more, that wise decisions can be made by applying Indigenous values, especially around the environment where the knowledge system of that interaction has existed and survived and been proven to be robust, is there and able to offer some sound solutions to many of our problems, but it's being denied purely because it's Indigenous.
Russell talked about global citizenship, and I was opening up the challenge that local identity and a place to stand is where a lot of authentic progressive politics will come from. And I just wanted to take the chance to do a little bit of standing back and sketching big picture stuff, to try to pull out the two strands that I think have to go into progressive trade policy. One of them is the Maori, the tangata whenua stance and the treaty, and the other one is the progressive tradition in the white settler society. And if you think back to the 1940s, when Labour was in power and Peter Fraser was the Prime Minister and New Zealand went off to the United Nations founding meetings and so on, Social Democrats in New Zealand had an internationalist vision, constructing a better world order, coming from a strong place to stand, the national first Labour government. It's an odd mixture of words. And if you look back to what happened then, we had a global economy which was dominated by the old empires. And Rod Oram this morning talked about asymmetric power. And I thought, hey, hang on a minute, power is asymmetric. That's what power is. power is asymmetry. If you get symmetry, power loses its bite. Power up against countervailing power gives you balance. And in a sense, that was what happened in the 1940s with the United Nations. The great powers ruled the world and sent their navies around to enforce their will, right? And the 1940s, that was broken. Decolonisation took large chunks of the world out from under the control of the great powers. Their navies became less important, and we moved into an internationalist vision of a global economy in which people could realise their own identities within their own spaces. And then, over the following half century, the world system moved on, and we have a new imperialism. But it's not an imperialism of great powers with their navies. It's the imperialism of transnational capital, operating with, instead of navies, ISDS and international trade agreements and so on. And the international moment for progressives, it seems to me, is therefore one where you're actually wanting to get countervailing power back into the system. It means trade agreements which respect the national democratic spaces for protecting values that matter to people, while seizing the opportunity to exercise global citizenship on the stuff that is collectively important to all of us, like climate change, and constructing the new international architecture that will take us there. So, you know, it's a new conjuncture, but Social Democrats ought to be standing in there simultaneously holding their national spaces, because like it or not, the nation is the repository of countervailing power in the world system still, but stepping out to create something new collectively. So that's my little manifesto.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and this one I guess is to Russell and Simon, which is around if we have a defence in trade agreements that will allow the space for environmental regulation nationally and locally, how does this affect how does this prevent the chilling effects of trade agreements where anything that could be remotely ambiguous it becomes a threat to the power of governments to regulate? And you know, how do you do these carve-outs, or is that not the right way to proceed? Is it better to instead of carve-outs have positive multilateral environmental agreements?
I'll speak briefly and then I'll hand over to Simon, but I don't think it's an either-or, right? You need both. So you need strong multilateral agreements, and then within the economic agreements, trade agreements, then you need clear defences around pursuing environmental objectives. I think the thing to remember is that the state is always working within the context of potential for legal risk. Legal risk is just a daily reality of the exercise of state power. Whether it's legal risk from a firm in New Zealand that might sue the government if it does something, or whatever. There's legal risk is a constant reality, and so they've got to judge legal risk. The problem with ISDS is that it's very hard to judge the risk because it's such a bloody arbitrary system. You never know what decision you're going to get out of a panel, and there's no appellate courts. You don't even know what where it's all going to end. It's not at all consistent. So if you had some really clear direction in trade agreements around protecting the objectives of multilateral environment agreements, I think that would help create some real certainty for states operating in that space. Because currently there are dozens and dozens and dozens of cases underway right now against governments for taking action on mining, environment, you name it. And that creates tremendous uncertainty for government.
I think Russell makes a very good starting point that government deals in risk to start with, but the principle I was advocating earlier is that foreign corporates gain no greater rights to operate in the host country than parties in that host country have anyway. In other words, they then just become like any other risk that the government takes on that might be indigenous. Point two, and that takes care of ISDS, it just is gone. But also, back to this notion of actually having the environmental constraints as a top-line item, that it is explicitly recognised either by reference to other treaties or by explicit statement that, I'm sorry, these are the constraints in which the policy is then constructed. So there is no ambiguity to deal with or exceptions or carve-outs. It's actually a really first principle statement. You may consider that very ambitious, but I share Jeff's view that very soon we're going to be dealing with the planetary emergency around climate change, and that's going to be number one. And the question is then just how to do it.
Thank you. It's very helpful. Whānau, we have a question for you. At 5 o'clock, we were going to watch an interview with Joe Stiglitz, and we could, if you like, let this panel run for another 10 minutes and then play the video. Who would be staying for the video of Joe Stiglitz interview? Are you prepared to stay on for a little bit longer than 5:30? So we'll let this run for another 10 minutes and then start the video, if that's okay with everyone. Okay, is that okay with the panel? Great. A question for Jeff. If we have a border tax adjustment for exports, how then does that maintain the pressure on exporters? Particularly if they're exporting to countries that don't have border tax adjustments.
I guess by maintaining pressure, you're saying maintain pressure on them to cut their emissions.
Indeed.
Remember, I said this is second best policy I'm talking. This is not the ideal world. And I'm looking at a way in which a nation within its own borders can set a carbon price that is confronted by its consumers and its producers insofar as they're acting within the national economy. If there's a club, then it applies across the economies that are in the club. But it's a policy that is premised on existing in a world where there are some nations out there that have defected, that are running high carbon economies that are not putting a price on carbon. And you're looking for a way to maintain the integrity of your national policy in a world where others are not maintaining the integrity of global citizenship. And you don't want your exporters to be eliminated from the world market, because that's counterproductive. And you don't want your import competing sectors to be exposed to the dumping of cheap goods from out there. You just need a ring fence that enables you to pursue an efficient national carbon pricing policy without getting it overwhelmed from outside. That's the point. And it's not ideal. It's second best, maybe third, but it's probably the best you can do.
Okay, thank you. You want to add something? Cool. We have another question, which is for any member of the panel. Where we're talking about measures on climate change and inequality being coupled together to say that we can't really separate out the issues of a just response to climate change without also addressing social inequality. How does that change the picture on what we've been talking about? We've been talking primarily about environmental issues, but what changes when we say simultaneously we have to address all of the different dimensions of social inequality as well?
You can do serious climate change mitigation with high carbon taxes and an economy with relative prices all oriented towards cutting emissions and have gross inequality alongside that, right? If you want to deal with gross inequality, you deal with gross inequality. If you want to deal with the carbon problem, you deal with the carbon problem. Some economists like to say, one instrument for one problem. And if you start trying to solve a whole lot of things simultaneously with one instrument, you lose traction on all of them. So I would obviously like a very strong anti-inequality set of policies in place, but I wouldn't make my carbon policies contingent on having those. I'd want them to stand on their own merits.
Yeah, I might just do a different take on this. I mean, I would argue that any environmental issue has social, cultural aspects to it, and the displacement of Indigenous peoples from their lands being a very classic example, but that marginalisation of people from their lands and territories it has been a global phenomenon. It's behind a lot of the poverty that we're experiencing in the world. And although it might be complex, if we haven't yet got the picture that you have to deal with the environment and culture and social and economic factors all together at the same time, then you're going to inevitably repeat the mistakes of the past and only look at one faction. We need policies that go across all of them. People are always impacted upon by decisions. So let's just make it as a given that every decision has a social element to it. And when it's talking about resources and the use of those resources, and there are Indigenous peoples in those countries, it's also going to impact on Indigenous people. That's a given. We have to fundamentally change the intellectual framework that we use to analyse things. And I always found it amazing that it took until 1992 for the governments of the world to actually acknowledge there was a link between environment and development. That's pretty pathetic, really, isn't it? And since then, although the link was acknowledged, they've just carried on as if you can still separate the two. We will not change the environmental degradation or eradicate poverty or deal with any of the other Millennium Development Goals, or whatever they're called, Sustainable Development Goals, without bringing all of these elements together.
Russell, you?
Look, I reckon that talking about the politics of it, obviously you need to try to get a broad consensus, right? So, whatever you're doing, you try to get as broad a consensus as possible for action, right? And so you need to take people with you, right, in order to do that as much as you possibly can. Doesn't mean you're going to take everyone with you, you're not. I don't think that the Zero Carbon Act, for example, needs to have the National Party vote for it. I suspect if the National Party votes for that act, it will achieve zero, because I don't think Judith Collins will let them pass anything that achieves anything. So I'm not a big consensus on all that we can only do this through consensus. I don't think that's right. I think that we have to be ambitious, and the future Conservative governments, for example, will follow it. So, I do think in terms of the politics, you want to have a just transition, you want to try to help people through this thing as much as you possibly can, but we should also just speak the truth that climate change is the biggest social justice calamity the Earth's ever faced. And that human beings have ever faced. So, I mean, we mustn't, the classic phrase, you mustn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We are going to need to make some rapid transitions. There are going to be some communities which are pretty heavily hit as a result of that if they're dependent particularly on a fossil fuel economy. We need to help them through that transition through a set of policies that try to bring a just transition. But we should also acknowledge that, if you worked in the oil industry and were being paid $150K a year and you lived in a community where everyone was in a similar situation, and then that came to an end and there was a transition to something else which was good but probably not quite like that, you are not going to experience that as anything other than as a problem. You're not going to be celebrating that. You're not going to be out on the street saying, woohoo! I mean, that's just the reality of it, My dad worked in the coal industry, that's just the truth of it, is we also shouldn't pretend that this kind of economic transition, which is pretty profound, isn't going to cause a lot of problems for a lot of people. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to deal with all the justice issues. I think that we should. But we shouldn't let the fact that it is going to produce some dislocation prevent us from taking this action to prevent the greatest social justice calamity we have ever experienced as a species. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if that kind of helps get the way through it. Yeah.
I'd like to pick up where both Jeff and Russell are talking about the need to keep a clear focus on climate change as the priority thing you want to tackle, and Araha talking about integrated thinking. And there's no conflict between having a very strong primary objective as climate change mitigation and also just transition and other factors that you're actually going to want to involve in it as well. And this is where we've been advocating for a Climate Commission to run a plan for this multi-decadal transition. The idea is that you actually begin to link, okay, how do you get carbon emissions down? And at the same time, what are the implications going to be about different ways of doing that and at different paces of doing that? It's actually, instead of a model where we have something exclusively focused on dollars, we produce budgets that are exclusively financially oriented, you actually pick another variable, which is carbon, and you actually start running budgets according to carbon and see how the world looks like that. And the same ability to look across where communities may be impacted through land use change, where people may be impacted through fossil fuel decline, you can actually think about the programs that government can put in place to support that change and to support the people who will be changing. And this is the paradigm shift that I'm hoping we'll go through soon now.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much for staying. I think it's been really rich discussion, and please give a nice big round of applause to the panel.
Thank you, everyone who has